We're led to believe that if you buy enough land, work hard and become a farmer, you could eventually live there. But that's only partially true. Planning law isn't interested in how much effort you've put in. It wants proof that living on the land is genuinely necessary for a viable rural business. As once you try to turn a field into a home, the question changes completely. So can farming actually earn you the legal right to live on your land? Living on the road, waterways or off-grid in the UK, Dickie Dread. And this is part 25 in the video series. We're still on chapter 3, living on the land, all water, parking up and planning reality. So today we're going to cover the agricultural route and the field to farm reality. And that term field to farm was coined by David Ackerman, and I'll show you his latest book and website in a minute. So originally featuring in the books and websites of David Ackerman, and as I say, they've been updated now, so I'll show you that after we finish the reading. One of the few recognised pathways to lawful residence on rural land is through agricultural necessity. Unlike most informal routes, this is not about avoiding the planning system, but working directly within it. The idea is simple in principle, but difficult in practice. You must demonstrate that living on the land is essential for the proper functioning of a genuine and agricultural enterprise. This sits within the framework of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 and is guided by policy by the National Planning Policy Framework. The system does not grant permission for rural dwellings based on lifestyle choice or preference. It asks a narrower question. Is there a functional need for a worker to be on site? And is the enterprise capable of supporting that need over time? To answer that question, or those questions, evidence is required. Not just intention, but activity that can be demonstrated and measured. This usually includes records of land use, livestock numbers, cropping patterns, inputs and outputs, and increasingly some form of financial accounting. The enterprise must appear real, continuous and capable of sustaining itself. A few animals and a loose plan are not enough. What is being built is not just a small holding, but a case. In practice, this often begins informally. A piece of land is used at a low level. Grazing, planting, basic management. Over time, activity increases. Fencing is installed. Water is secured. Storage appears. The land starts to function as a working unit rather than a passive holding. This gradual development is important because it creates continuity. Planning authorities and inspectors are far more persuaded by something that has evolved over several years than by a proposal that exists only on paper. At a certain point, applications may be made for a temporary rural workers' dwelling, often in the form of a caravan or mobile home. This reflects long-standing planning practice, allowing an enterprise to prove itself over a defined period. If permission is granted, it is usually subject to conditions, time limits, occupancy restrictions tied to the business, and requirements to demonstrate ongoing viability. Decisions at this stage are not always final. It's common for applications to be refused and then resubmitted in revised form or taken to appeal. Over time, this can form part of the overall case, particularly where the underlying land use continues to develop and strengthen. However, this is not a tactic in itself. Repeated applications without genuine progress on the ground are unlikely to succeed and may weaken credibility. What matters is not the number of applications, but whether the enterprise behind them becomes more convincing over time. Alongside this sits the Caravan Sites and Control Development Act 1960. Even where a caravan is used, its stationing for residential purposes can require planning permission unless it is clearly incidental or otherwise exempt. In the agricultural necessity route, that permission is part of the process, not something to be avoided. If the enterprise survives scrutiny and continues to develop, a further application may be made for a permanent dwelling. This is where many attempts fail. The bar is high. Authorities will examine whether the need is truly essential, whether it could be met by existing accommodation nearby, and whether the business is financially sound. A lifestyle project dressed as a farm will not pass the test. What is required is something that looks, on paper and in practice, like a viable rural enterprise. His whole approach Sorry, turn the bloody thing off. 2 seconds. Okay. In the end, agricultural necessity is less a loophole than a test. It asks whether the presence of a person on the land is justified by the land itself. Where that can be shown, permission may follow. Where it cannot, the system tends to close the door, regardless of how much effort has gone into the attempt. In some areas, planning authorities have shown more flexibility in how these principles are applied. In parts of rural Wales, including Powys, that's where I live, there has been willingness to consider temporary accommodation such as caravans or mobile homes where they are tied to a genuine land-based activity. It does not amount to a general permission to live on land. Any such arrangement still requires planning approval and is usually granted only where there is clear evidence of functional need, ongoing activity and a realistic prospect of the enterprise developing. Permissions are typically temporary and subject to conditions, including restrictions on who can occupy the dwelling and how the land is used. The relevant framework comes from Welsh planning policy, particularly Planning Policy Wales and Technical Advice Note 6, which allow for rural enterprise dwellings and, in some cases, low-impact development. These policies can create opportunities, but they do not remove the need to demonstrate that living on the land is justified. In practice, this means that helping a landowner, volunteering or informal involvement is not enough on its own. The activity must be structured, evidenced and recognised as part of a genuine rural enterprise. Where that can be shown, temporary mobile development may be considered. Where it cannot, the default position remains that residential use requires permission. In some cases, enforcement action involving residential occupation is influenced by wider considerations, including the presence of children and the need to ensure appropriate housing and access to education. This can affect the time and manner of enforcement, but it does not create a right to remain or replace the need for planning permission. In the end, agricultural necessity is less a loophole than a test. It asks whether the presence of a person on the land is justified by the land itself. Where that can be shown, permission may follow. Where it cannot, the system tends to close the door. What matters, though, is that the door does exist. It is one of the few routes that can turn land-based living into something stable, recognised and lawful. Those who succeed tend to do so through shortcuts, not through shortcuts, but through persistence, building something real, documenting it properly and aligning it with how the system understands rural life. For some, that process will be too slow or too structured. For others, it offers a way to anchor independence in something that lasts. The outcome is not guaranteed, but it is possible. And where it works, it provides a level of security and continuity that informal approaches rarely achieve. Now, I did mention that there is a book on this subject. I've got this version, which is the older version. I'm going to hopefully get the newer version, which came out in 2025. It's David Ackerman is the author. It's a very, very good book, highly recommended. And also, you can see his website there, and there's loads more information about the book, and also loads about how you can use this process to gain dwelling on agricultural land. So, agricultural necessity isn't a loophole. It's one of the few recognised routes that works with the planning system instead of trying to avoid it, which means the real challenge isn't simply owning land or keeping livestock. It's proven that your presence on the land is essential to the enterprise itself. And if that's the standard, how many people are really seeking permission to farm? How many are simply looking just for somewhere to live? Okay, next up, still in chapter 3, living on the land or water, parking up and planning reality, and we will cover woodland, charcoal and alternative uses.